Hello everyone, it's Gigabeef here, and today we're checking out this MPX that I took from a guy who, unfortunately for them, lost the drum mag battle against the RPD. Oh no! You like saves the day. So here we have it in all of its glory, a fully decked out MPX. I haven't seen one of these for ages. The MPX hasn't been meta for a very long time, but with the new recoil changes, the gun is actually quite good. Now, the first thing that you might think when you see this weapon is that it is quite over-engineered, which is possibly true, but we're going to run with this thread for the time being just to see where we can get it to. Now, the first thing that I'll say about this build is that it's actually okay. It is actually okay. There's no overswing problem with this weapon, which I thought there might be using a drum magazine. The ADS speed isn't too bad, and the recoil is also extremely low. So the reason that we're bringing this build into the workshop, so to speak, is to try to decide if this is actually as good as it can be, or whether there's something better and much more cost-effective that we can do whilst using this weapon. Now, some of you may notice, if you are particularly familiar with Mechanic, where this weapon has actually come from. So if we go to Mechanic 3, we can see that whoever put this weapon together probably used this one as a base. It's got the illusion suppressor, which we can see on their build. It also has the long barrel on the upper receiver, the 14-inch one, and it's also got this Midwest Industries M-Lock handguard as well. And you can see that's pretty much the base for this. They've bought the foregrip, they've changed over the stock, done something to the pistol grip, and added this big 50-round magazine. But other than that, it's pretty much the start that you get from Mechanic. Now, at 95k, I actually think that that's quite expensive. And this build that this person has put together, if we go to find parts, we get rid of all the things that you get with the gun. You get these things. They've changed the stock themselves. We're going to keep on the retractable piece. The upper receiver we need to keep. The barrel you get for free because you get it with the gun. And then we also just need to remove... I'm going to take off the flashlight just because that's kind of personal preference, just so it doesn't mess with the build and our comparisons between some of the stuff that we're going to do. But I will keep on the holographic. We obviously don't need this either. So that's going to be 114,000 rubles for all of these parts. So they're buying elsewhere outside of the actual build itself. And because the gun costs 95k from Mechanic, that's 210,000 rubles, which is a lot of money for a build like this. But as I said, the gun isn't too bad. So as I said, the ADS speed on this isn't terrible, but it can be better. But really, the bigger question that we need to ask ourselves is, like, do we actually need to go to all this bother of doing this? Because you can buy an MPX from Peacekeeper, an MPX SD, or a regular one, and is there any point doing all of this stuff to the gun when it has hardly any recoil anyway? Well, we're going to answer that question in a moment, because I think the thread that is important to notice about this is the muzzle velocity of this particular weapon. 411 meters per second isn't particularly quick, but if you go to Peacekeeper and you look at the MPX suppressed version, the silenced version, the muzzle velocity of this is 325 meters per second. So although the vertical recoil is 32, it's basically the same as we've got on this gun, you have about a 1/3 increase in muzzle velocity moving to this particular weapon. So if we're assuming that that is the rationale for building this particular gun in the first place, let's optimize it as best as we can. One thing that I don't really like about this gun is the Midwest 14-inch handguard. This can be improved greatly by using the OEM Lancer version instead. If I take off the vertical foregrip and take off a few of these other pieces, we'll be able to see the difference that it makes. This doesn't give you anything, which will change in a sec, but this OEM gives you +5 ergonomics, and you do lose a little bit of recoil, but as you can see, it hardly makes any difference. It's -3 on this and -4 on this. With a weapon that has such a low base recoil like the MPX, you can swap over to the OEM, no problem. Onto this, we're going to add a vertical foregrip. They use the shift. I don't think the shift is terrible. It's kind of like a middle ground between the SE5 and the Cobra. The Cobra has 1% recoil reduction, the SE5 has 2, and the shift has -1.5, but it's got the same ergonomics as the SE5. So it's kind of like a small downgrade. It's like strictly worse than the SE5, but it's a bit cheaper and easier to access, so I could see maybe why they wanted to use it. I'm probably going to use the Strike Industries Cobra because the recoil just doesn't really matter so much on this gun. As you can see, we still have 33, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to notice one recoil between two different builds. One really odd thing about the MPX and a lot of the handguards for the MPX is that you can stack them up with cantilever mounts. This is probably not really intentional, but for only 50 grams, you can get one ergonomics. And you can put one here, 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 and you can put one here. And so for 250 grams, you can get 5 extra ergo, which is a really good bang for buck in terms of weight. Now, suppressors wise, the Illusion 9 is not actually that bad. They're all kind of similar. They're either the same ergonomics with slightly better recoil, like the SRD, and then you also have ones like the Rotor, which are cheaper, but you lose a bit of ergonomics. The other one that is compelling over the Illusion is the Silencer Co. Osprey, which is pretty good. There is actually a barter for this as well. There's for a drill, and so this is sometimes okay towards the end of the wipe, not really towards the start because everyone's trying to upgrade their hideouts. But I think the Osprey is potentially interesting because we can get ergonomics from so many other places on this weapon, and it's actually quite difficult to reduce the recoil anymore. I'm going to use it because getting -2 recoil on this gun is a little bit more than we can get doing basically anything else. So we're going to use the Osprey, and they weigh basically the same as well, so we don't really lose anything on that basis either. For the rear sight, we're going to make the usual optimization and add the Defiance. And then in terms of the stock, this is kind of interesting. I do think that there is a valid argument for just adding something like the Viper PDW. What this person has done here, they were level 34, so they don't have access to the ARE tube, I might point out, because this is a Mechanic 4 part. If you were going to go meta, we'll do that in a second, you add the ARE tube. But what they've done is they've just added an ADAR tube because they probably didn't want to pay for the ATP, which again makes sense because you only get half a point of recoil, which on this gun makes no difference. And then they've added the GL Core, which is the highest ergonomics adding dock that goes onto a buffer tube, which is fine. And that's, you know, plus 15. But you can replace the whole thing with the Viper PDW, and you do lose a little bit of recoil. You go up to 32, but you gain 6 more ergonomics. So if you do want ergo, if the Viper PDW is an option, then I suggest that it's potentially something that you could look into doing. It's also not that expensive either, like 30k from the Flea or 11k from Mechanic, so it's not terrible. However, just because we're going to look at the best build that you can for people of any level, we'll use the ARE. And then I'm going to use the MOE stock here because normally we use the Daniel's Defense if we're trying to get more ergo, but given we already have kind of enough ergo, I'm going to use the MOE instead so that we can get ourselves down on vertical recoil to some really cutting edge point. Then in terms of the pistol grip, they've used the F1, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And I'm going to put on the Growl instead, which gives you an extra 3. Again, this is a max trader part, so they wouldn't have access to this, which is the reason why they've done that. There's one more thing that we should upgrade, which is the charging handle. We basically can go up to the Guys Lee charging handle instead. And this one is pretty cheap. This only costs us about $15 to go up to, so we may as well use that. And that finishes off our build with 51 ergo and 29 vertical recoil. So the real question is, does this make any difference? Does it matter? Should we bother with this? And is there any point? So I had a quick look just in an offline factory raid at the difference between the two builds. I've got their MPX and I've also built the one that we've just made as well, and went to go and ADS them underweight at about 26 kilos, which is just a normal ADS regime. And their MPX ADS is in 11 frames. As I said, I was quite surprised how quick this was, and mine ADS in 9 frames. When I loaded myself up with a bit of extra weight up to about 36 kilos, theirs then moved up to 12 frames and mine up to 10. So again, it doesn't really make any difference if you're a little bit overweight. Obviously, the more overweight you get, the worse that your ADS speed gets. It's something that people kind of forget about. And so it's still honestly not that bad. The one thing that's interesting about my build is that yes, you do need some higher level parts for it. But in terms of the economy, once you do actually get there, it's really not that bad in terms of pricing. This whole build, if you buy every single part completely from scratch, and you don't even need to do that. Some of these pieces we don't even need, like the upper receiver, because we're going to be buying the gun, just say from the flea market, then this only costs us 230k. Which is only 20,000 more than changing the one from Mechanic. So I don't know really if there's any point in the Mechanic barter. I think it's very, very expensive. So muzzle velocity aside, what about the much cheaper alternatives on Peacekeeper? As we said, on Peacekeeper, you've got this one at Peacekeeper 2, which is a regular MPX, and there's also this silenced MPX as well, which I have actually used myself. Now, I went to go and test this one as well, literally just as it is. So if you go into my character screen, you can see I put on exactly the same sight on the top, and I use it as is with the 50 round drum without changing anything, without adding a vertical foregrip or anything like that. And this one as standard had 12 frames of ADS speed and 14 frames when overweight. So a little bit worse than both of the builds that myself and our opponent made. And what's interesting about this is that yes, the ergo is slightly lower because we haven't done anything to it, but the SD version of the MPX is surprisingly heavy. It's actually heavier than my gun, amazingly, given that when you look at it, it doesn't look like it should be. But it's because the MPX SD suppressor is really weighty compared to something like the Osprey. This is 0.6 of a kilo, whereas on my build, the Osprey is only 0.27. So you actually end up with this surprisingly heavy heavy gun, which is 200 grams heavier than mine, even though it looks really, really tiny. So the final part to this is, can you just upgrade this very quickly and easily with something basic and see what that gets you to? And yes, you can. So in this particular build, I just added a few parts to it. We put the RVG black on, I put an OMRG black, which is also a relatively cheap part. This is Peacekeeper 3, I believe. And then I put on the MPX CQB stock, because this gives you quite a lot of ergonomics compared to all the others and is really easy to do. This build gets you to 58 ergo and 33 vertical recoil, which is basically just the same as the others. Outside of the muzzle velocity, this gun performs identically to both my weapon and the one that they've built. And lo and behold, when you go into Raid to go and check it out, it actually has 9 frames of ADS speed, both underweight and overweight, so it ends up beating out both of the longer builds. So unless you're looking for muzzle velocity in particular, the overarching conclusion to this video is that there's really no point in modding the MPX at all. You can't really tell the difference between 28 recoil and 33 recoil. They look basically the same. And this is so much more cost effective because you can buy the whole base from Peacekeeper and just change over a couple of parts and you have a fully working gun that is completely fine. So if you're thinking about using the MPX, you could just get away with something like this, no problem, and know that you're running basically the meta build without having to do any of the stuff to it, which I personally thought was quite interesting. I hope you enjoyed this one. This was a little deep dive for me because I haven't investigated an MPX for a really, really long time. As usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.